Yo, it's not here with a quick meta guide on the Restoration Shaman in TBC since it won the poll that I put up recently for the next few specs to be covered. And to be honest, Resto Shaman has always had a cheeky spot in my gamer feels since I rolled one in retail for Somewhere Plateau Progress, so I'm pretty excited to talk to you about this one. As always, a little disclaimer of course, this video is an overview broken down into a few sections that I wanted to find as a consumer, and these are first the basics for PvE, talents, stats, raid gameplay, that kind of thing. I'll finish up the PvE basics with a brief discussion on the race choices, followed by the strengths and limitations of the spec, or put in other words why you may or may not want to play Resto Shaman in TBC. Finally, we'll cover professions and PvP, but for extreme detail, you may want to seek more focused guides on these topics. With that said though, let's get straight into the talents. Generally, any gameplay centered on purely raiding, you will play 0-12-49. There are several builds available, such as Deep Resto, which essentially gives you all the tools of the Resto tree with the mana from Ancestral Knowledge in row 1 of the Enhanced tree. There's also a build that takes some elemental points to help you do more damage and have higher quality of life and solo content, or potentially get the decent damage passive from elemental warding. These are all good builds, but I'm going to focus on the totem twisting build as it is fundamentally the best spec for broader raid performance, and you can tweak it here and there if you want certain options, which we'll discuss. Immediately in row 1 of Resto, the slam dunk is 5 out of 5 tidal focus, and we might grab improved healing wave depending on what we're trying to accomplish specifically. Next, you'll want to take ancestral healing and totemic focus for the armor buff on crits. That will be useful on tanks especially, whilst totemic focus helps keep mana strong if we're on twisting duty. You can also take improved reincarnation here, but again, it's subject to your preferences and will be taken from later talents in the tree. Healing focus is the next focus of the talents. It's not as impactful as in PvP, but raids have more splash damage in TBC, and this helps ensure we are spamming kills without delays via mechanics. We also take Totemic Mastery for quality of life, and will potentially grab some anti-threat talents also, but again, these are subjective and we'll get back to them. Next, we want 5 in Restorative Totems, and at least 4 points in Tidal Mastery for the easy crit increase. You can take the 5th point potentially also, again related to your preference, which we'll cover at the end. Nature Swiftness is of course a slam dunk, whilst we can also take Healing Wave if we're including improved Healing Wave from row 1. From here, most Resto Shamans take the remaining points in the rows below, easy picks like Purification for some extra healing, 20% extra chain heal, and a pretty strong intellect to healing power talent in Nature's Blessing. Notably, of course, our Manatide Totem and the new spell Earth Shield, which is an efficient tank heal, or alternatively a damage increase to casters that don't have pushback talents available to them for encounters that have regular splash damage. The 5 points in Nature's Guardian could be literally 0, especially if content is on farm, and this is where the main source of our flexible points come from. It's not a bad talent, but it's often useless because it's not super common to dip that low, and even then it's a % chance. It's closer to quality of life than anything completely broken. So let's talk more about these points that can be moved out of Nature's Guardian. If you want to utilise the twisting build with the added potential to tank heal and have an easier time topping tanks in dungeons especially, you can shove the 5 from Nature's Guardian into row 1's improved healing wave, because we sure as hell aren't casting healing wave without that talent taken. This would then incentivize you to take points that you would likely put into the 5th point of Tidal Mastery, the crit talent, and 2 points into the threat talent Healing Grace, into Healing Way, because Healing Way ties into our healing wave, making it better the more we use it, essentially. With that said though, I would personally stick to the standardized build that is focused on chain heal spam, because typically you'll be doing that no matter what spec you actually have. That's usually what raid leaders will be expecting their 1 or 2 Resto Shamans to be doing. So onto the 12 enhanced points, and we first take 5 in Ancestral Knowledge for a bigger mana pool in lieu of better options. We then take 2 in Guardian Totems for more grounding totem potential, which is actually relevant, and in rare cases more from Stoneskin Totem, but that would require 2 Shamans in the group, which is extremely unlikely. We'll take 2 in improved Ghost Wolf and 1 in improved Lightning Shield just to get to the 3rd row, and this is the real payoff for delving a little deeper into Enhance than the other builds. Enhancing totems is significant. If you have any physical DPS in your group, this is a substantial buff to them. It allows you to totem twist with the maximum available stats provided to the group. And having this talent in your build just by default, as opposed to going deep resto all the time, adds versatility to your shaman. Shamans are already hyper versatile, but having that option again to be twisting for a melee group is really helpful, even if you're not in a min-max group. If you've got loads of melee groups, suddenly that Resto Shaman's going to want to totem twist for the raid DPS. So all in all, it's a good thing to have those 12 points in enhancement typically. But before we do move on, I do want to highlight that if you are quite sure you're never going to be in a melee group, and as such you would never have to totem twist, then you're definitely best off going deep resto, because you get to take all of the talents that we've discussed just now about the trade-offs between them, and essentially in a different way you're hyper versatile because you can literally tank heal and chain heal spam in the exact same spec. Swings and roundabouts, I personally would always advocate for the totem twisting build for versatility's sake, but if you're 100% sure that you're not totem twisting, go deep resto. It is the bread and butter spec if that is the case. So that's our build. What about stats? Okay, so I don't know how many gods shamans worship, but your one true god is and has always been spell haste, even if leatherworking hadn't just been excommunicated from its lofty space in the TBC meta. In short, healing power is of course the standard stat to stack, but spell haste is worth around 1.7 healing per point in the early stages and scales all the way up to being worth around 2.1-ish healing, perhaps even more by the end of the game. Early on though, spell haste is pretty rare outside of a trinket proc like Scarab with Infinite Cycles. However, from tier 6 and Zelaman onwards especially, haste is really common and begins to scale you to the moon. You'll take it all like you've just time walked back to summer 2020 and GameStop stock is still below $5.
Seize our fate.
Outside of healing and haste, MP5 is decent, it's nice. Mana can be tight if we are max ranking, and we would prefer to max rank HPS wise. It's just not a stat to go overkill on, but it's pretty nice, and you'll find loads of it before haste starts becoming more of a thing on gear in the end game. Crit rating is just kind of fine. Honestly, it's just so much worse than haste that you'll typically only take it when it's paired alongside haste, though exceptions do exist of course, and in the early game of course haste isn't a thing, it's a spell crit. It's just fine. There you go, that's stats in the nutshell. Just get faster, forehead. So now we're on to the gameplay, and as a healer it's of course very open to interpretation and your specific assignment. Loosely I'm going to cover 2 assignments, kind of, and just explain a couple main ways you may end up playing Shaman, but no nuggies for guessing what the most common gameplay loop will be. To get the elephant out of the room though, yes, chain heal spam is pretty much the primary job still. You'll maintain water shield on yourself, your totems of course, whilst often placing earth shield on the tank or potentially a caster for preventing pushback in some scenarios. But outside of that, it is spamming chain heal. Rank 4 can be used if mana is tight, but ideally we would want to try and spam max rank if possible. I want to highlight at this segue that often case spamming chain heal into the tank is actually still the way you would help top the tank and other damaged players, just because chain heal is nutty on overall HPS compared to our other options. However, if damage taken per second is very specifically on the tank without any splash damage, you can utilise Healing Wave. This may at times just be some Healing Wave spam, but sometimes you'll get to stack Healing Wave times 3 with rank 1 waves, followed by a Chungus wave to top the tank. But I'll be real with you, you will likely press chain heal for most of your TBC raid career. With that said, we're on to race choice, and I'll ignore Alliance for the obvious reasons. Once again, all controls are top of the pile, when are they not? However, this one is more of a clear choice, at least to my mind, and I think largely that is the consensus. We just heard about how OP haste is, right, for Resto Shaman. Well, this is essentially because Resto Shaman throughput just scales better with more casts than raw healing power, and berserking plays into this. Likewise, since your berserking window doesn't need to go inside a bloodlust window like most DPS specs, you can freely choose a point of lower HP to try and get more haste from it. And that fits well with why a healer pops a cooldown, right? Damage goes out and you want to respond with some bigger HPS. It's a perfect match of sorts. With that said though, I must highlight that Orc is just never bad. If you like Orc, go Orc. But honestly, berserking is very, very synergistic with the overall Resto Shaman gameplay. Tauren is style points, but alas, no dice in PvE. PvP wise, there's an eternal debate on Orc stun reduction and Blood Fury versus the War Stomp and slightly bigger booty of Taurens, but I'm not the one to tell you which is slightly better. I've literally seen a 50-page thread on this back in the day by actual gladiators at the time as well. Just know that those are the two options for that kind of gameplay. Go with whatever you think is best. So now we're on to the strengths of Resto Shaman, and I honestly came into this thinking, where on earth do I start? The overarching point that I'm going to state right now, just to avoid any lack of clarity, is that they're insanely powerful because of utility and versatility. But I want to break it down as clearly as I can because there's just so many faces to this strength. The first thing is that Shamans can perform both a tank heal role just fine, as well as a raid healing role to a very good extent, almost to the best possible extent. And they do this with utility that far outstrips all other healers by a factor of 1,000,000. Totems and Lust are just insanely powerful, and Resto has the added benefit of Manatide Totem, which is significant at least for arcane mages, if not for other healers too, depending on group and encounter. Now, when we take enhancing totems, as I spoke about earlier, Resto Shamans have that added flexibility as an easy to add healer in lieu of the enhance in the hunter group. And once again, if shaman swapping remains a thing, the ability of shamans to do everything either decently or very well means that every other healer is cuttable beyond the unique buff they provide, and in the case of Resto Druid, that's actually 0, for Holy Priest that is 1 if you force them into improved Divine Spirit, and for Holy Paladin it's 1 for the third blessing. And I say this in respect to Druids do have amazing multi-tank HPS and longevity, whilst Circle of Healing Priest is actually higher potential HPS on AoE healing too, despite how good Chain Heal is. The problem is though, that it's just more impactful to have Shaman swapping if that exists. All in all, Resto Shaman is just insane. It's the jack of all trades, which is just a little too good in some areas to justify being capable of everything, but that's where it's at. If you enjoy healing and never want to see the bench, you go Resto Shaman. Now we're on to the downsides, and to be honest, it was pretty difficult to state stuff that I disliked about Resto Shaman, and you can kind of see why, right? They're just really good. However, the main thing that people often mention is that the gameplay can be repetitive. However, I want to add to that discussion that outside of maybe Resto Druid, it's hard to argue that any healer has particularly interesting mechanics going on, and some would even say that Resto Druid in TBC isn't that engaging either. So it's more of a healer downside than a limitation of Resto Shaman itself, at least to my mind. Secondly, if you wanted the tippity-toppity throughput, if that is you, if you're about that life and there's nothing wrong with that, you want to go Resto Druid or Circle of Healing Priest. They will have the highest potential in terms of just getting that sweet World 1 log, if that's what you actually want to try and get. Both those specs can be higher healing than Shamans in the correct conditions, but neither are as desirable utility-wise, and Shamans are pretty great across the board. They never do bad HPS, regardless of not being absolute number 1 on potential, and tuning would need to be pretty damn strong for the HPS gains of those aforementioned specs to actually matter. So again, not really a downside. Simply put, I had to dig pretty deep on a niche for this downside. There's just not really any downside risk to Resto Shaman. Buy this stock if you're a healer main. So this leads us to professions. Early on, without doubt, you want tailoring for Primal Mooncloth. It's just hyper efficient. White Mend is also great if you don't have access to world boss loot via raids or fat gold reserves, because they are BoE. Enchanting provides free 40 healing. It's the best profession benefit generally speaking, and if you really want to min-max, you can pick it up and drop it each time you have Bis Rings. Jewel crafting provides some good value, but the end game neck isn't so hot for Resto Shaman thanks to the Zalaman neck being so absurd on the haste value. And in lieu of drums being the meta, leatherworking provides the best chest in the game once we get to Sunwell Plateau. It's worth noting, of course, as well, that Redeemer Alchemist Stone provides a fantastic reason to go alchemy in the late game too. It's a really efficient trinket. The Giga min-max, if that's what you're into, would be enchanting picked up and dropped, whilst using jewel crafting and tailoring until tier 6, then switching to alchemy and leatherworking in wait for the big benefits a little bit further down the road. This allows you to abuse early tailoring gear through to the end of tier 5 with a little boost from the jewel crafting gem, followed by getting 2 Bis items in the end game once they release. If you want to go enchanting and CBA to re-level it all the time, skip jewel crafting and alchemy. Jewel crafting gain is small because it's a single gem essentially, and the alchemy trinket isn't a clearly Bis item. If mana isn't a thing, there are better trinkets for throughput. It's got competition if you do farm out Sunwell Plateau fully at the end of the game. This brings us to PvP now, and generally speaking, you're not going to have as great a time as in PvE. You're definitely a notch below Disc Priest and Resto Druid as far as overall versatility and power level is concerned. However, there are decent 2s comps and competitive 3s comps available to you. Primarily in 2s, the popular comps of Resto Shaman are with Arms or Retribution. This is to abuse Wind Fury Totem and essentially provide some insane burst with Bloodlust. From what I understand, Ret Paladin is your best bet in 2s, but 2s is not your best home for pushing maximum rating either way. 3s is quite a bit better for Resto Shaman, with a similar story in terms of playing very offensively with Lust, Purges and Totems. Your best bet for 3s is often God Comp, which is Shadow Priest Mage Resto Shaman, or Shadow Play, which is Shadow Priest Warlock, where you melt them inside Lust and provide Purge support to make life difficult. A pretty good but quite rare comp on top of these 2 top options is Ret Arms Resto Shaman, essentially performing a melee cleave with Lust and Wind Fury alongside the Purge support. Outside of these comps though, it's often thought that Druid or Disc just does the job better, so life isn't as rosy in PvP as it is in PvE. That said though, clearly good Shamans excel with these comps regardless, especially in 3s. That's all for this one though. Let me know whether the overview gets you hyped to roll a Shaman. I personally am heavily leaning towards Resto Shaman as an alt, but with that said, I'll see you next time, hopefully in your notifications.